So yeah, just a quick background about me. I'm Manuel. I'm organizing ACIT, the European branch, is kind of trying to manage them, and I'm situated in Mannheim, where I also build up a local branch where we have meetings just to talk about science and get connected with people that are interested in similar things. I'm a theoretical neuroscience Ph.D. candidate at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim. So we are kind of trying to understand the brain better on a pretty fundamental level, how to analyze data from the brain better in order to understand mental illness and to find like better causal explanations for what is going wrong in mental illness and how we can find treatments that actually manage to help people get better. So it's kind of a cool field, and we apply a lot of techniques that are currently also being used in artificial intelligence research. So it's like a very lively field with a lot of interesting stuff going on. And one of the very interesting things I've been thinking about a lot is going to be the topic of this presentation, of the interrelationships between statistics, like the general field of statistics and what's going on in the brain, under that known under the name of the Bayesian brain hypothesis. Just a quick structure of this talk. We'll be talking about statistics in a very general sense, and then move on to like what can go wrong when statistics aren't properly used. I will talk about the Bayesian versus frequentist perspective on probabilities, and how the Bayesian perspective for probabilities neatly connects to what is going on in the brain and how statistics is incorporated into the brain. And I will use these kind of insights based on that to talk a bit about COVID-19 and the current situation and how we think about COVID and numbers and with relation to that, and how we can also make some pretty bad mistakes in judging the situation based on these insights. So first of all, like, why no one likes statistics might be a bit of an exaggeration, but not too much. Like a lot of people, basically everyone in their education has some connection to statistics, also in the social sciences and in medicine and all of the sciences. Everyone is kind of involved in statistics, but statistics is pretty hard, and you usually only have like a little bit of contact with it, and then it seems pretty boring. It's like boring tests and kind of distributions and a lot of formulas. So a lot of people don't really get a connection to statistics. Sorry, there's someone not muted. So can everyone please mute in? Yeah. So yeah, statistics has kind of this bad reputation of being not too interested, and there's not a lot of people really passionate about it. And so maybe this talk can help you change your perspective on that a bit. So what is statistics? It's basically everything. It concerns the collection, organization, analysis, interpretation, presentation of data, according to Wikipedia. And if you think about that, that's pretty much everything that's going on in the sciences. So if you want to find something out about the world, you can't really get away from statistics. So statistics is the backbone of science, of all of science, and science in the sense that science is the art of learning from data. So the world appears to us as data. We look at the world and we make measurements, we collect data, and then we analyze it, we interpret it, and we try to find something. We build models based on that. We hope to gain insights about the world based on these models. And a lot of things are going on in statistics, and it's a big field, but one of the things that's pretty crucial in statistics and all of the sciences is called significance testing. So the overall question, you find something out, you run an experiment, you collect some data, and you have kind of a theory of what could be happening. And you try to find out whether that theory you have is actually significant, whether the result you just discovered is actually worth reporting. And there's a lot of, it's absolutely crucial to the process of science, but there's been a lot of problems connected to that. One of them is called the replication crisis. I don't know if you've heard of that, but basically the name is self-explanatory. A lot of the core results in modern social sciences and psychology, for example, don't really replicate. So the basic idea behind replication is if you run an experiment, the same experiment twice, you should get the same result twice. So as just a physics example, you go to the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, you try to find the Higgs boson, then you just run the experiment going on in the Large Hadron Collider just 1,000,000 times, and then you find the Higgs boson. And if you were to build a different Large Hadron Collider at a different place and run the exact same experiment, then you have to find the Higgs boson as well. Then your result replicates. But the problem in psychology, for example, is that it's harder to find to run an experiment 1,000,000 times and be actually sure that your hypothesis is significant. So there's been a lot of problems with shaky statistical methods and a lot of irreproducible results. Among the most popular results in the fields have proven irreproducible. So there's an inherent danger in bad statistics, and a lot of research is afflicted with the low statistical power. I don't really want to bash on psychology here, but it's kind of has been most prominent in this replication crisis, but it's like spread across all the sciences. So statistics is actually really important. So having said that, I want to now move on to like a more positive part of this talk, like a more beautiful part of this talk as well. So I want to talk about how the statistics connects to what is going on in the brain and how it can help us as a perspective to gain an understanding of the brain. So as I just defined, science is kind of the art of observing data and analyzing it statistically and then build models based on this data. And that's precisely what the brain does in everyday life. So we observe the world constantly, we analyze it, we build models, and we kind of try to understand what's going on in the world in order to survive in it. So that's kind of the core connection, first of all. And just as a very brief introduction to probabilities, I think there's like a very interdisciplinary background in this talk. So there's a lot of different kind of affinities with math. So I will just give a short overview what a probability distribution actually is and what probability means in this context. So I think everyone has seen this Gaussian curve, this kind of distribution, this bell curve. And so there's just two things you need to understand. There's a mean and the covariance. So the mean just gives you kind of the most likely value in this probability distribution, kind of the peak. Let's say the distribution shows us how tall men are in Germany. And then the peak is at 1.78 meters. So if you just go to the street and look at a random German man, then the height is probably going to be, it's most likely going to be 1.78. And a standard deviation gives you like how big the deviation from that mean value is. So that could be like 10 centimeters. So if you look at 1.78, 1.68, 1.88, 68% of all people you will randomly find on the street will fall into that interval. And the further out you get, the more unlikely it gets that you will find like a specific value. You probably won't ever find people that are 250. But this covariance, kind of this variance, how like uncertain your sampling is, varies completely, like depending on the probability distribution you can look at. And there's also not only Gaussian curves, although a lot of things are distributed in a Gaussian way, but there's also other distributions, and the covariance can be much, much wider. So like the mean could be like a certain value and the covariance could be like 10 times the mean. And I will also readdress that when it comes to COVID-19. So first of all, like what is actually probability? It seems obvious to all of us, kind of intuitive, but it's not that obvious. And I have this kind of thing here where I can flip a coin. I'm just gonna run a mini experiment for all of you now. So now we have 1 heads, 2 heads, 1 tails, 2 tails, 3 tails, 4 tails. So I just ran a random scientific experiment where I had 6 samples. 2 of them were heads and 4 of them were tails. And how can we think about this now? There's basically 2 big, different ways of interpreting what just happened in the coin toss. So the frequentist approach is that probabilities just relate to the frequency of events occurring in data. So it means it's just the probability is the frequency of us getting head or us getting tails. And if we take a lot of data, I just took 6 samples, which is just a very tiny amount of samples. But if I take 100, I will probably get like a nice result that gives me kind of a good indication of how probable head is versus how probable tails is. After my 6 coin tosses, I had a probability of 2/3 heads and 1/3 tails, I think, or the other way around. But it's kind of like my first estimate of the frequencies. And so in the Bayesian perspective that I will be talking about now, there's kind of a perspectival shift of what a probability actually means. In Bayesian perspective, a probability reflects our kind of knowledge and our expectation of what is going to happen. And we are also factoring in what is called a prior belief into the probabilities. And if I go to this website, the coin toss website, then I have a very strong prior that the probabilities are going to be 50-50, because if they are not 50-50, that web page is absolutely worthless, because it's supposed to give me like a 50-50 outcome. And if it doesn't do that, it's just pretty terrible. So I have a prior assumption what the probabilities are going to be. And now if I run this experiment, if I get like 4 heads and 2 tails in a row, how does my confidence in that 50-50 ratio shift? Like, how do I integrate new information that I get through from data in the world into my prior framework, into my prior assumptions about the world? And this is called posterior inference, which is done with this beautiful formula here, Bayes law. And it's called Bayes optimal, and it's kind of the heart and soul of Bayesian statistics. So to sum up what the Bayesian perspective actually means, probabilities express a degree of belief in what is going on in the world. These priors that we have express our pre-existing models and expectations about what's happening in the world. All of our models are inherently probabilistic. I will address that in much more detail soon. And Bayes' law tells us how these models are updated, given new information. So that's kind of the heart and soul of everything. And from this Bayesian perspective on statistics, we can now move on to understand what is going on in the brain better. So as we can maybe frame it in that way, that the brain is the world's oldest data scientist. So the brain has been analyzing and looking at data and building models for millions and billions of years, partly. Maybe not our brains, but the brains of our ancestors. And so it's kind of interesting to think about the brain as a data scientist and how the brain could be using statistics. Statistics is also very widely used in AI research, because people have realized that if the brain uses statistics and if we can build artificial intelligence based on statistics, then maybe we can also understand the brain better based on that. And this Bayesian perspective gives an overarching theory, which is called the Bayesian brain hypothesis, which is still somewhat controversial, but I think independent of the controversiality, it's a very kind of interesting perspective on what could be happening. So what do I mean by the brain has internal models of the world? So the brain has models of pretty much everything that's going on, of your surroundings, of what a cat is, what a color is, who your friends are, what your friends are like, what a face is. And these models are probabilistic and generative. Generative means in the sense that you can actually, if you close your eyes or if you just fall asleep and dream, your mind will generate random faces and random people and random landscapes and everything, because it has an internal representation of what is going on there. Computer scientists have managed to reconstruct these kind of probabilistic and generative models. One very famous approach are the general adversarial networks by Goodfellow et al. This is Goodfellow. No, I'm just kidding. This is actually a pretty cool example of a person that does not exist. So I just randomly generated with a general adversarial network this face. So this person doesn't exist, but the model that we can train a computer to understand what faces look like in general, and then we can just teach them to randomly generate faces, pretty much like what's going on when we are dreaming. So that's what's meant with we have probabilistic and generative models in our brain. So we have prior assumptions about how faces look like. So we see faces if we look at clouds, for example, and we kind of always look at the world through this lens of already kind of knowing what the world is like. So this is pretty much the heart and soul of the Bayesian brain hypothesis. So we have these models of the world, and we make predictions about the world, what's going on in the world, and how the world is supposed to behave. And we kind of try to, if we get new information, we try to integrate that information into our pre-existing models and our frameworks. And we also try to predict what could be happening in the world based on these internal models in order to react and survive. One of these aspects is called predictive coding that Ben will mention a bit. And just to give you one more example of how these prior assumptions can work, because we live in a world that's full of light, we kind of understand how lighting works. And if you look at this checkerboard, then you have 2 different squares here. You have the dark squares because it's a checkerboard, and the light squares. You have this thing. We immediately recognize that there should be a light source somewhere here, and that there's a shadow on this B square. And what this tells us just implicitly is that the A square is obviously much darker than the B square, because the A square is dark and the B square is light, and it's just shadow. But the thing is, if you kind of draw a line between those two, they have exactly the same color, which is continues to surprise me, even though I've looked at this 20 times. So it's just pretty weird that we just implicitly have these models of which really affect our perceptions on the fundamental level. And there's also a paper that showed by Brown and Friston how we can understand these ambiguous sensory inputs and these optical illusions, knowing that under ambiguous input, like our brain is actually just creating the base optimal interpretation of the data and integrates it into the model, which is kind of a cool way of thinking about it. So to break that down again, what the brain is actually doing is minimize something called surprise with respect to its sensory inputs. So the brain has basically two ways to react to new information. It can just change its models. It makes predictions, and these predictions are wrong. So it changes its model of the world, or it can act in the world to make its predictions come true. So you can think you have the model of the world that tomorrow I'm going to eat breakfast, and your brain can actually act to make this prediction come true. And this is also true on like maybe less obvious examples. So this, as I already mentioned, Ben will also be talking about this theory a bit and mention it again. But as I said, this theory is kind of controversial, but also like a very fundamental look at how life itself works and how the function of the brain kind of ties in with how life itself works, how thermodynamics connects kind of very different layers of thinking about the world. And it's a very beautiful theory. And yeah. And just to come to the last point of my talk is how this uncertainty and this Bayesian brain perspective ties in with what we are facing right now with COVID-19. So the brain constantly kind of, as I said, minimizes surprise and uncertainty about its states and kind of tries to match them into its pre-existing models. And there's a big caveat that comes with that, because these evolutionary optimal models of the world don't necessarily have to be the most scientifically accurate, because we kind of have a good enough brain. The brain is good enough in the sense that it's built to survive. It has to be very quick. Like the practical limits that come with trying to survive in an uncertain world are just not the same as kind of trying to come to objective truth and conclusions about the world. So there's kind of this mismatch that means that sometimes we have very bad intuitive statistics, and what can be optimal, as we saw in the example of optical illusions, might not be kind of the best thing on a kind of like scientifically rational level. And cognitive biases creeps in, what Ben is going to be talking about after my talk. So we kind of experienced this pandemic, but I think it's also a pandemic of bad statistics or questionable statistics. We have all been kind of bombarded with these numbers, death rates, recovered people. So because we kind of look to reduce uncertainty, we cling to a kind of an objectivity that numbers give us, or this kind of uncertainty reduction that always comes with having numbers to attach ourselves to. So we have case numbers, fatality rates, a lot of curves showing future developments, projections, all of that flowing around. But numbers are not always objective, and numbers shouldn't all be treated the same way. Just one example, because I'm from Germany. If you look at the case numbers in Germany, we have, as of now, 141,399 confirmed cases of COVID, which sounds like a lot, but there's currently a serology study, so it kind of checks how many people have antibodies and have already been infected. And this indicates that we could be a factor of 11 off, so it could be 11 times as many people infected. So there's just a lot of uncertainty, which is, again, hard to cope with, but also it's very important to keep that in mind. And kind of my giveaway lesson of this part of the talk is that especially with relating to COVID, it's important to consciously observe how numbers are reported. I read this statement in the newspaper this morning that the kind of chef of the Robert Koch Institute in Germany said the reproduction number is now at 0.7, and I was kind of angry at him for phrasing it that way, or at the newspaper for reporting it that way, because as we saw, like as good Bayesians, we always have to factor in uncertainty, and as the numbers we're looking at are extremely uncertain at the moment, this kind of factual statement about the objectivity of a number is just not really legitimate. If we are off by a factor 11 of the people infected, we could also be off by a factor of, or like by a huge amount with respect to the reproduction number. And so in the Bayesian sense, we also treat these numbers as random variables. So we could have a distribution where the mean is at 0.7, but we have kind of this uncertainty factored in because we look at the distribution with a certain width. And we always have to think about where do these numbers come from? Is it a scientific experiment? What kind of significance testing is going on? Do we have in a control group? And as we saw at the example of like the sciences, a lot of studies in the sciences themselves can be statistically flawed, and like it's always very difficult to come to rational and objective truths and insight about the world. And sometimes it's nice to embrace uncertainty in order to like take the time to judge a situation more rationally. And with that, I give over to Ben. Thanks for listening. And if you have questions, ask them at the Q&A session in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu, for this. So basically, just for everyone, like just to really like make it simple, like what the most important takeaways are from what Manu just said. So basically, Manu, maybe if you could stop sharing your screen, I'm being mirrored, which looks quite funny.
Sorry about that.
No, sure.
Did it stop sharing now?
Yeah, it stopped sharing. So basically, I think the most important takeaways here are, so basically our brain works like statistics to some degree, right? We observe information, we see the world, we see trees are green, right? We see that, for example, a lake is blue, right? Or we have smells, and this information we always like, we use it to create a model of what is a tree, or what does a tree smell like, or who do I like in the world, right? So basically we're creating these models, and it's very fascinating that actually the way our brain does that is very similar to how statistics work, right? That's basically kind of the key message here. And so now basically what I'm going to focus on in my part of the talk is more about, okay, now we know our brains have this weird statistical processes. Now we know we live in a world where statistics and science are important, but we cannot always trust them. There's a lot of mess going on. A lot of research labs don't use statistics properly. So who can we trust, right? And now it's really more about giving you guys some stuff that you can take home and work with. So let me share my screen as well. It will probably lag a bit. Does everyone see my screen, or is it
Not
still
yet.
lagging? Yeah, I think it's just because we have so many people in this call, so things take a bit of time. But yeah, just once it works, give me a sign.
Now it works. Now I can see myself. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Then let's start with my part of the talk, which is more about decision making under uncertainty. So first of all, what does uncertain mean? I mean, uncertain is a widely used term across different sciences, and it usually means one of two things. It either means things cannot be measured properly, or things cannot be predicted properly. So uncertainty, we can just say it's a state which involves imperfect information. And the very fascinating development in this field is that there's basically two types of uncertainty for the brain. One is about risk, in the sense you know that if you do something, 30% chance you will lose some money. And there is another type of uncertainty, which is called ambiguity, which means you don't even know the percentages. So you have no idea with which percentage you're going to be ill tomorrow or not, right? So there's a very different, it's a very different thing to either say, I risk to lose my money at 30%, or I don't know how much and how quickly I'll lose my money. So these different types of uncertainty, they also have different neural networks. So they have different brain regions that deal with the different types of uncertainty, which is a very strong evidence that probabilities actually create a different function in our brain than not knowing anything. So if I give you a number and tell you your chance to fail this exam is 12%, that's very different what happens in your brain if I tell you, I don't know how good your chances are, but you can try. So basically in our life, the whole world is uncertain. We always have to trade off how much we want something and how much we risk getting it, or how ambiguous it is. For example, you apply to a school, right? There's the risk you get rejected. So how much is your effort and the risk worth to you compared to what you can gain from it? Or on the other side, let's just say you're at home and watching television. How much is the risk, or how much is the effort worth to you to get up and check if there's something in the fridge you want to eat, right? Do you want to trade off this ambiguity? So you can really think about ambiguity as like layers of the world that you can cut off one by one. So every decision you make in the world, every decision you make, you have to cut off uncertainty layer by layer. Sometimes there's as good as no uncertainty. Sometimes there's even something we could almost call certain, but there's always a trade-off happening. And what you see on the bottom of the slide here is that over time, the more experienced you become with something, the more certain we become about it. Of course, if you try something for the first time, right, you have no idea how good your chances are or how high the risks are if you didn't ask someone else first. But over time, you're becoming more and more fluent. And so why is this important? We know that from evolutionary perspective, humans want predictable and certain environments. So we don't like situations where we have uncertainty. So what Manu said before is very crucial here. So there's two ways how we can get rid of uncertainty. Either we remove it by finding out what's happening, by talking to people, by doing research, or we just don't care anymore about being certain and we tell ourselves that we know exactly what's going on. And again, ambiguity is a stronger type of uncertainty. So if if you have no idea how high your risks are, you usually like it less than when you know at least like you have a 50% chance to fail. So just really try to make this applicable to your own life, because it should be reflected with your experiences as well. And there's a lot of factors that can change this, like your personality, or a growth mindset. Like, are you a person who believes that you can change in your life, or do you believe like you are a fixed person, there's nothing you can do to change yourself? That, of course, greatly changes how much you care about uncertainty, because if you don't believe you can change in your life, then you want a very stable and secure world in which you are best adapted. If you believe that you can change with anything, then you're probably a bit more tolerant to uncertainty. There's also big 5 personality factors, and which I won't go into depth now, but there's also a very important thing like called sensation seeking. So some people just really enjoy uncertainty. So some people really enjoy if their life is messy and they don't know what's going to happen next. That also happens. It's just the fact that most people don't like change and don't like uncertainty. But there are a few who have a certain genetic disposition that makes them enjoy these situations. There's also some interesting theory why this is the case. So from an evolutionary perspective, back in the old days, we needed some humans who were 100% sure to stay alive, and some people who go out and explore new territory. And so that's a theory why there are these different types of people. So most people have to make sure they have a secure life and they make smart decisions so they can stay alive and make sure the human species continues. And some people, they take really great risk and live very crazy lives, and they try out something new, and then they either fail and no one copies it, or they succeed and people copy it. Of course, what I said before, expertise changes your risk behavior. There's also some gender and age differences which shape the way that people react to risky and uncertain situations. Now, the big problem is the future is coming if we want it or not, and the future is super uncertain. There's nothing more uncertain than the future, right? You have no idea what's going to happen to you in 1 year. And it's actually quite fascinating that not so many people have fear of their future. Like, we usually only stress out if we have very clear things we scare about, but we're not scared about the future as a whole. So why is that the case? So going back to this free energy model that Manu mentioned, it's a very predominant and fascinating model that has its origin in neurobiology and psychiatry, which can explain all kind of biological, or which claims to explain all kind of biological behavior, be it on the cell level, the brain level, or the system level. We will naturally focus on the brain level here. So basically, the idea is that everything, every system, which includes humans, of course, but it can also be a forest, right? A forest is not one individual; it's a bigger system, right? And also for humans, we are not just individuals. We also live in a social context and in a society and in a government, right? So, or in a governed groups. So there's a lot of different levels we can analyze people. But basically the key idea here is that if we perceive something in the world, right, what Manu said before, we match our models we already had and we compare it. So let's say I expect the door is open, right? So my model of the world is that the door is open. Then I look at the door and I see it's closed. So there's a mismatch between my model of the world and what is really true. And then I have basically two options. Either I can update my priors. I can just say, oh yeah, of course, the door is closed, right? And just assume that, or I can initiate action and actually go to the door and open it. So the big revolutionary thing the free energy principle claims is that all of our action, so every action you take, is because you have a mismatch of your model and the world, or you want to make it match. So basically you're hungry, you expect to eat something, you realize, oh, I didn't eat, right? So that's the hunger. The hunger is the signal, hey, your model that you should have eaten and your body, they don't match. Therefore, you do the action of eating. And it's actually quite fascinating. If you really observe your life with this idea, it matches very well a lot of situations. So what is this basically about? In the end, it's really about reducing uncertainty, right? We talked a lot about statistics and uncertainty, and basically the brain might have developed this model simply because we don't live in an uncertain world. The big problem with this is that the brain sometimes makes trade-offs where it takes something, where it keeps a model or a knowledge and information, where it sticks to it, even though there's a lot of evidence that should change it. For example, you're in a relationship and the relationship is really going badly, but you don't accept to see it, right? So your model is, no, my relationship is perfect, but there's actually a lot of information that would tell you otherwise, but you decide to ignore this, right? And that is just because you prefer to live in a world where the model is true, where your relationship is going well. And on the bottom, you see a very fascinating experiment where they actually replicated this prediction error, these prediction error models in a robot. So please ignore the math, but basically the big message here is, if you program a robot with, or if you ask a robot to behave in accordance with predictive coding patterns, they show the same type of actions humans would show, which I think is a really nice evidence from 2018 that there is a big chance that we actually work in a statistical way to some degree. The other cool thing is this really shows like how you can apply neuroscience to robots, which I personally think is one of the greatest avenues for neuroscience to progress in the coming years. Again, please don't bother about the details here. This is just really fascinating to show that there is actually even biological evidence for this. So there are certain cells called pyramid cells which seem to process exactly this kind of prediction error information. And for example, here on the left, you see the whole system in the brain, how visual perception works, right? How your whole, how it works that you can see. And there's a lot of top-down and bottom-up mechanisms, which basically means bottom-up is whatever you see. So you see a tree that's neutral, right? Or you see, I don't know, you see the sky is blue, or let's say you see the sky is kind of reddish. And then top down means your knowledge comes in. So, you know, okay, if the sky is like red, it doesn't mean that the sky is bleeding, but it means that the sun is setting, right? Or rising up. So that's how our brain works. We have the sensory information, and then top down, we start to change it. Needless to say, there's a lot that can go wrong in this top down changing, but I just want to say here, there's a lot of biological evidence that the brain actually works like this. And this, again, please ignore the complexity. It's just really, again, about there's some brain regions, for example, who determine where something is, and some determine what it is, and they are really linked in these feedback loops. So you have you have information, okay, I see the sky, something looks like a cat. Oh wait, cat in the sky doesn't work. Okay, let's try again. Okay, it's just the clouds that look like a sky, right? So that's basically our brain is constantly fighting between the first intuition we have and the knowledge or these priors that we also possess. So basically you can really understand your brain as a constant communication between different hypotheses, between different ideas about the world, where some ideas are stronger than others. And those ideas are your model of the world, right? And action in this theory, action would be nothing other than the consequence of realizing that your model might not be fully accurate, or an attempt to make it, to tell yourself that your models are true. So in the words of Einstein, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? So we want simple models. We want life to be easy. We want to really know what's going on, but humans tend to be lazy and make the world simpler than it actually is, which is just because the brain doesn't have infinite capacity. We are limited. We are not as smart as artificial intelligence, for example, and that's why we often take shortcuts and just explain the world easier than it actually is, hoping that this is true, right? So bringing all of this together, we discussed so far, basically decision-making happens between your personality that you have, your emotions that you feel, the values of something you want to get. For example, if you make a decision to get an expensive car or an apple, then money can also drive a decision. The social context, for example, if you're alone, you would behave differently than when you are with your friends. Your environment, of course, if there is, for example, if it's very hot, you're probably going to think differently than if it's a very nice weather, and your genetics and the evolutionary genetics we all got from our ancestors. And all these factors, they come together in this circle where we expect the world to be in a certain way. Then we get data about the world, how it actually is, and we have this mismatch. And if we have this mismatch, we either learn from it, we deny it, we just ignore it, or we act to change it. For example, we know that a certain social group we really care about is not being treated fairly in society, right? It doesn't match our expectations, so we decide to act to change this. But again, the action is only there to make the models in our mind true. Just something you can take home now from this is, for example, prospect theory. Prospect theory is a very fascinating model. At the bottom of the page, you see Bargetzi et al. 2020 in progress. I'm really proud about that. Did some research on that. So basically, the big claim here is that to the brain, fundamentally, losing something or not gaining something are completely different. So if you don't get an extra 10 euro versus you lose 10 euro, it's always going to bother you more that you lost the 10 euros, right? That's very important. People care more about negative things than positive things, right? Which is, I think, also a nice indicator of why depression rates are so high. So our brains are naturally made to care more about negative than positive things, because if you only focus on negative things, you're more likely to survive, usually, right? That's another evolutionary trick we have in our brain. So also prospect theory is like, if you tell someone they will lose 10 euro, you can try this with yourself right now, right? If I ask you to lose 10 euro for sure, or you take a gamble where you will lose the 15 euro, but I don't tell you with which probability, you sometimes, you probably would say, okay, I just lose the 10 because I don't know how likely it is that I lose 15. But if I tell you have a 30% chance to lose the 15, you might consider taking the risk, right? And that's again what I said before. If we have numbers, we feel more safe. Even if the statistics are bad, we feel better than if we have no idea what our chances are like. And so what I researched a lot was how your way of communicating can change that. So if you tell someone, we are about to lose this and this amount, versus we are about not to gain this and this much more. One sounds much worse than the other, right? And if you tell someone numbers, if you give them numbers behind your statements, they are much more likely to feel confident than if you just tell them we have no idea how big the risk is. So these are very subtle things, but something you can include in your communication, right? Always make sure to communicate numbers if you want people to feel better, and make sure that you frame things, well, depending on your goal, but make sure you frame things not as a loss, but maybe as not gaining something. So rather than saying I wasted 5 years, you could say I didn't gain as much in the 5 years as I wanted. And for those of you who have mental health challenges, which is a very common thing in modern society, right? I really believe that there's good, powerful way for people to make their lives better just by thinking differently about losing and gaining. So going on, of course, a very tricky thing is if you always stick to statistics and numbers, you will in most cases be correct. So whenever if you only stick to statistics in your life, to good statistics, you will in the most cases be correct with what you do in your life. However, there are so-called black swans. A black swan is an event which is very unlikely to happen, like super unlikely, like for example, the coronavirus or Second World War or the financial crisis, right? Which are very unlikely events, but they have extreme consequences, right? And so the big problem is if you only follow a very strict statistical approach, you will tend to dismiss very unlikely events, right? So we see now that the big problem is that we live in a very uncertain world. We are biologically made to not like that. So we should maybe stick to numbers and statistics, but at the same time, that might also not be perfect, right? So the conclusion so far would be life is quite complex. If I'm allowed this joke, let me go on to another topic, a social context, right? So there's nothing or almost nothing which entails more uncertainty than a social context. Who can you trust, right? If you see a beggar on the street, usually you feel pity for it, right? That's an evolutionary mechanism we have. So you want to help the beggar. Now the question is, can we trust the beggar, right? Is he or she, are they just faking it, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty about spending and donating behavior. For example, many people, if you ask them, you have like 78% of people who wish they would donate more to charity, but a lot of people also say like, oh, I don't do it because I don't believe that the charity is actually good. So we see how uncertainty is really deeply ingrained in our social structure. So just rushing very quickly through social decision making. Basically, whenever you make a social decision, you trade off your own. I just take this away in case you cannot see the screen. You always trade off your own goals with someone else's goals, right? It's usually better for us if you just selfish and only care about ourselves, right? But that's just not how humans are made. We like to share, we like to help, we like to cooperate, right? But every time you help someone else, you actually give away something that you have yourself, right? So in the case of beggars, there's a very interesting studies that show that people usually, they use the uncertainty as an excuse to not donate. So they know they don't have a probability, right? They don't know 12% of beggars cheat you and the other 88% are serious, right? We don't know. So we just assume 80% of beggars are trying to cheat us, therefore we don't give money, right? That's just how the brain works. We try to, these models that we have of the world, we try to change them around however we want. And before we saw that usually if something is not certain, we tend to assume the worst possible outcome. We see it here again, right? If something is very uncertain, we just assume it's the worst possible outcome. That's why we really, really have a need for clarity and this reduction of uncertainty, right? Which, as we saw in previous models, might be really ingrained in our biology. So what we see is that usually, for example, if there is someone in great risk, for example, on the street, there's a car coming, only people who have really strong social preferences, social convictions, and high risk tolerance will help. So even if someone is a super kind person, they are less likely to help than someone who is really okay with living in risky and uncertain situations, which I think is a very important thing to think about. So sometimes people who don't help, they might just not be antisocial, they might just be very scared people. And going back to decision frames I mentioned before, like how we can frame decisions and change the impact they have. So there's a very fascinating story of Kappas et al., who found that if you ask people, do you want to donate money to this beggar, yes or no? People usually don't want to help. But if you, however, ask them, what do you think, how much could your money help these people? People are more likely to support. So the very interesting thing here is, if you just let people choose yes or no, they don't need to think a lot. So they usually tend to ignore it and choose the option which is easier, right? But if you ask people, and you can apply this to business, you can apply this to your friends or when you want something from your parents, if you ask them more about how much would it help or how much does it mean, right? They have to invest more time to think about it, right? So you challenge their models more, and then that gives the chance to update the model and actually make a change. So that's, you see, that's very, very abstract now, but really think about this. Every day you talk to people, right? They are updating your models. Every day you open your eyes, even when you dreams, right? You update your models. You update your models about yourself, who you are, what you like, what you want to do. You update your model about your favorite soccer team. It's the best team in the world. Oh, well, they lost 5 times. Maybe not the best, right? So you have to really understand that every day you live basically is a statistical process where you integrate a lot of information about the world into the way you see the world, right? And your own brain keeps fighting about different explanations for the world around you. So for all of us, including like people who study this for years, it's most likely that the reality we see, the beliefs we have, are to some degree just the easiest and most comfortable assumptions that we can have. So what an impressive multi-layered evolution-shaped statistical problem-solving machine the brain is. So now let's go to the final part of my presentation, where it's really about what we can do in our life and what we can look out for. So basically, I know a lot of you definitely know Sigmund Freud and the idea of the subconscious and the conscious, right? So this has been kind of replaced, not everyone agrees with it, by System 1 and System 2, which is from Kahneman's 2011 book, which I can highly recommend. Well, it's the newer version, the 2011 one. I would really recommend people to read this one. So System 1 and System 2 is basically the idea that we have an automatic system, which is all our priors, all our sensations, just everything you bring with yourself, right? The subconscious, right? Just everything you have, your biological tendencies, the things your parents taught you, the things society taught you, all these kind of automatic information, which you just use because we don't have enough brain power to really think critically about everything. Like, for example, if you go to the fridge and you have like 2 yogurts in there and you like the color of one more, you just take the one where you like the color more. Like color, it makes no sense to be a good argument for what is inside the product, but you don't have time to really think a lot about which yogurt to take. So you just take your automatic system in your brain. And then System 2 is a slower and a more sophisticated system where you actually think about things. So for example, what do you want to do in your life? This shouldn't be an automatic decision. This should be something you really, really carefully think about. The big problem now is that our brains are not perfect. Even though we had millions of years of evolution behind us, we're still not at the point where our brains would be perfect. And so it often happens that decisions which we should make with our System 2, we still do them with System 1, and that can cause quite a lot of mistakes. So these mistakes are called cognitive biases or fallacies, which are semantically different, but I don't think it matters much in this context. So basically the idea is that we have some things a lot of people keep doing that actually don't make a lot of sense, but we just do them because our brains are limited and because the world is so uncertain that all our models communicating in the brain just cannot catch up with how fast the world is changing. So for example, I'm linking this to the Bayesian brain. we have anchoring. So if I ask you, how much do you think you would like to spend for food every month, right? If I just ask you this uncertain question, the answers of people will vary a lot. But if I ask you, this question and I say, what do you think? 100, 150, 200, right? 500, 800. So if you give people like anchors, you actually sneak a prior in their brain. So you sneak something in their brain that they then use to make their judgments. And this is, of course, very often used in sales. So when we discuss the price of something, you tell a high price first, so the anchor is high, and then you negotiate it down, but the anchor is still a high one, right? Another thing is availability heuristic. It's the tendency of, please remember, this is basically concerning almost all people, right? Almost all people follow these kind of mistakes many times a day across their lifetime. So availability heuristic means that we tend to overestimate information that we can easier remember, right? And again, so if we have strong priors for something, we'll probably use those instead of like really carefully thinking about them. For example, if I ask you to remember 3 good arguments why your life is good, and then I ask you to remember 6 arguments why your life is bad, of course, it's harder for you to think about 6 cases than 3. So you will have the impression, oh, it was easy for me to think about good things, but harder to think about the 6 bad things. So probably my life is good. So that's a very simple trick, again, that people use and how they totally disrespect numbers, including every one of us in this call. Cognitive dissonance is a very fascinating phenomenon. It basically means if you have a model of something you really feel strongly about and you have a very strong evidence that goes against it, you will just change this evidence. So for example, you believe that Benjamin is a horrible keynote speaker. Now you attend a good keynote of him, right? So you will just say, oh yeah, but he was just lucky, right? So basically that's the idea, that you try to, even though you have evidence for something, you try to lie to yourself, change it, and make it sound like it's not enough new information to change your models. Confirmation bias is similar. Confirmation bias just really means that we are more attentive to information which confirms our models. So let's say you really believe coronavirus is a lie and it's all a conspiracy theory, so you will be more likely to read information that tells you exactly that, right? If you think coronavirus is the worst crisis ever and it's the apocalypse, you will be very, very attentive and selective to only hear information that confirms your beliefs, right? And that's actually, fascinatingly, that also goes about the people you engage with. Usually we only like people who to some degree share our values and opinions, right? And so basically, because our models want to get confirmed, so to say, we even change our circle of friendships because they just don't fit anymore what we perceive ourselves or the truth to be. Hindsight bias is very fascinating. It basically means that people, when they look back in time, they always assume that, or often assume that they had perfect information before. So basically, now the coronavirus, we are in this crisis, right? Now people are looking back and saying, why did people not act much harder on this before, right? But this completely disrespects the huge uncertainty we had before. Like political leaders had the uncertainty, do we shut down the economy or let this virus spread, right? You don't have probabilities, right? You don't have numbers behind this. So it's a huge uncertain decision. And making this decision is extremely hard, right? But now that we have more information, right, it's very easy for us to look back and judge what would have been the right situation. And linking this again to mental health, right? A lot of times in our life, people are actually unhappy simply because they say, if I could go back, why didn't I do this and this back then? But most likely back then you didn't know what the correct answer is and you had a huge uncertainty. And that's why you chose the way you did, right? So I'm trying to sneak in some motivation speech here. And now for the last two, which are more statistical errors, base rate fallacy and gambler's fallacy. Maybe gambler's fallacy first. So basically, if you flip a coin, the chance is always 50-50 if it's head or tail, right? If you play blackjack, right, your average probability is always the same to win. So the gambler's fallacy is believing that the longer you play in a casino, the higher your chance to win, right? So you're like, oh, now I tried 5 times, so the next time I should win, right? But that's not true. The next time, the individual event, right, it has the same probability like before. That's a very common mistake people make about statistics. And base rate fallacies, I think, also a very interesting one. It's basically also, again, linked to coronavirus. Many people think they have the virus if they cough a bit, right? But basically, if you think about the probability, the base rate probability of you having the virus, right, then you have to consider this statistical number first, right? So, or let's not take corona if it's too delicate topic. Let's just take a random disease, right? Let's say the disease has a chance of 2% that someone has it, right? And then you show some symptoms, right, of it, but still your chance should still be like considered around 2%, right? And then over time, when you get more and more knowledge and you're sure that it cannot be something else, you could be sure that you have the disease. But at the moment we see a huge, and I would actually be really interested to see that, a huge number of people who believe they have the virus who actually don't, right? And on the other side, people who trust the statistics and then actually end up having the virus, right? So we see again, it's not a guaranteed way to live if you always follow statistics, but in average, you will end up being on the right side more often. And another funny one about base rate fallacy is basically, just everyone can think about it. If you think about a very muscular, bearded man who in his free time, he likes driving cars and drinking beer, and he likes shooter games, is it more likely that he is a banker, or that he is a banker and takes drugs, right? So here you have like the problem that a lot of stereotypes would say, oh yeah, probably he takes drugs, but the probability that someone is only one thing, like a banker, is always higher than that the person is a banker and something else, right? And that's again how we often neglect statistics, right? If you just abandon the math in favor of the models you have in your mind and try to force the models on the reality rather than allow the reality to update your models. So takeaways to take home: be careful with numbers and statistics. They are very important in life, but be careful where they come from. Be careful what kind of study it was. Just because there's one scientific study doesn't mean anything. It really needs to be over time, a lot of replicated high quality studies to make a proper statement about how the world looks like, right? Then when you don't know about something, actively gather information, because our brain tends to do nonsense in these times, and your first intuition is usually not true. So that doesn't mean intuition can never be true, but usually intuitions are not right. And I think it doesn't really harm to double check your intuitions with facts and good statistics, good studies, good numbers. However, again, be careful in the way you gather information. So sometimes we are very lazy. We don't want to actively gather information. We have biases in the way we read studies, we interpret them. So really try to, when you read a study or when you talk to someone, it's really like trying to be a tabula rasa, like be a clean paper and get things in without your model. You can still judge things later and say they're nonsense, but I think a part of critical thinking is really understanding that our models tend to be wrong a lot, but they can also be right. And now, importantly, however, again, also don't get paralyzed. So if we always overanalyze everything in our life, we are too slow, right? So if someone asks you, hey, do you want to come to the cinema tonight, yes or no? It's an uncertainty there if it's going to be funny or not. But still, if you wait too long, then you're going to miss it, right? So basically, focus on things which are really important and make sure you gather information nicely there. And the fifth one is more of a joke and totally not a self-advertisement. It also may help to join a network of critical thinkers and attend regular scientific seminars to broaden your horizons, so you have better and better priors that can help update your models. And now let me